Hi there, I'm Rachel Lee Nabors, a former React core team member. I've been like a head of developer education at AWS Amplify, worked at Microsoft Edge, but also an unasked for web animations evangelist, not necessarily in that order. I've been traveling and speaking in Europe about web animations longer than I've been working in big tech. And today I want to talk to you about react.dev. Also, by the way, just a special announcement. This only happened a few weeks ago. Now I'm working at Clerk, leading developer education there. But this is not about Clerk. This is about developer education. If you want to talk about Clerk, we've got a happy hour for that. So long before I was in big tech, I worked on web animation APIs and dev tools. You may, if you are older than Tejas, remember this particular website, and I traveled the world teaching folks all about how to animate the web. Now, in 2018, this is when things got interesting. I got into Vue because the community felt super inviting. Who here has ever written Vue before? Wow, hostilities. Okay, and how many of you have read the React docs? Like, what exactly are you coding in here? I'm wondering. But I got into Vue because it had a great animation API, and the community felt warm and inviting. The documentation, which was headed by Sarah Jasner at the time, had a diverse and inclusive community behind it. So it was one of the most approachable frameworks at the time. But I noticed something. I noticed that most six-figure salaries that I saw in job opportunities, they all required React. And I was newly on the job market, and I was like, oh, well, why? That's kind of all these people who are in love with Vue, who are seeing themselves in the Vue community, they are putting a cap on how much they can earn. They're not going to be eligible for these big tech roles unless they get React experience under their belt, but React is pretty tough, even for experienced folks. I ran the community surveys for the React team over the pandemic and before, and the feedback that we were getting was like, even having a computer science degree, React was really difficult to understand, to deeply grok, unless you'd been there since day one, reading every pull request, every GitHub conversation, every release note. And there are people who made that their job. And those people tended to go on to become influential trainers and leaders and charge top dollar for their courses. So there's not only a mental barrier now, there's a financial barrier. That's really hard. I have courses myself, and there are people in countries, they send me a letter and they're like, I can't pay this. This is several months worth of salary for me. Like, come on. So these are barriers for people like me to get six-figure incomes in the future. If only React were as easy to learn as Vue, I thought to myself. So what would I do about it? I decided to join the React team in London in 2019 as a developer advocate / documentation engineer hybrid. Pro tip, never join big tech in a hybrid role. It causes nothing but confusion for HR and all the different org structures. No. Just make sure you go in with one title. Just pro tip there. But I joined to democratize React education and pull this lever to help many more people like myself come to React, to build the gateway to React. And this is how I spent my pandemic, overhauling React's docs. You can check them out. Dan Abramov was my key collaborator on this. Most of the docs have been co-authored by both of us together. And now I'm going to promote them less and tell you more about how it really started. Before I could work on React, I just joined. You know, imagine you get to join the React team. You're in London. You're at Meta. Everything's fancy. And then the first, before you get to touch React docs, someone comes to you and says, we need you to fix react.native.dev. It actually wasn't even react.native.dev. It was github.io/Facebook/ I kept going. And it was, as you can imagine, it's not the first URL that springs to your mind when you think of React Native. I'm also curious. Raise your hand if you are a React Native person. Yes! I love the React Native community. I think I actually love the React Native community even more than the web React community. So they said, spin all this straw into gold. Make wrong way. Make react.native.dev better. So the first thing I did is I talked to the community. React Native's community is a mobile developer community. I come from web. I work with the W3C, not iOS. And so I figured, well, what do they want? Let me ask them. And I talked to individuals. I used to be in user experience, UX, so I knew how to conduct user interviews and surveys and gather information. I always say, don't infer from analytics, ask the person directly, and then validate through other measurables. If you can find a number that backs it up, great, but you might need to run a survey. So what people were saying was, they wanted more refresher material on React. Some people, especially coming in from mobile, which was something like 60% of the people using React Native's documentation, knew Android and knew iOS, but they didn't know JavaScript or React. And the documentation essentially said, well, you know React.js, right? Well, React Native is like React.js, only for mobile. And that was it. And that was not a great starting point if you're like a heavy-duty Swift UI kind of person, or maybe you're like a thought leader, an Android developer. And here's us in the web community being like, it's React.js, deal with it. They also asked for more visual content. It was just long essays, no visualizations. You couldn't see the components. You'd have to spin up a whole developer environment, which if you've ever worked in mobile or with Android, you know that's something you do with part of your day. It's not something you do before a little like, oh, I'm going to try that in my own. No, it's an involved experience. It takes a while to get to a hello world. More in-depth content on specialized topics. There were a lot of things that we weren't covering, like security, not as well as we could have. And of course, updating the component and API docs. Key thing about your documentation, it has to be up to date and it has to be correct. It can be written horribly, but if it is both up to date and correct, people can use it. React's documentation had that much going for it. React Native's did not. And interactivity. I mentioned that setting up your developer environment for React Native is kind of an ordeal. But if people could interact with the code on the website itself, they wouldn't have to go through that problem just to see, that's what an image component should look like. These are the props I'm going to need. I don't need to spin up my developer environment to solve this bug. I can interact with the code here on the site. And one of the fascinating, it was actually 41% of developers came from a mobile background. It was 76 come from the web background. But the interesting thing was, actually 10% of people who are visiting the React Native site, this is their first experience with development, period. So we needed to do a better job of onboarding them. One of the things we started with was building in literal context switchers to speak to each segment's experience. Android people aren't going to get the same metaphors that web people do. Specifically around things such as like design systems. There's very different terminologies used in both communities. So we added switchers that would let people context switch depending on their background. And added a React refresher. This is a little boilerplate course that uses interactive code sandboxes, courtesy of Expo, partnership with Expo, a wonderful company that works in the React Native space to ensure that people could actually work with interactive sandboxes on the site. This helped create a gentle ramp into React Native. And because the docs weren't built from source, we had to correct them and update them by hand. I ran a little community docs drive on our GitHub, and this was a great way for the community who wanted to find a way to give back to contribute to building out the documentation and adding interactive examples to each one of those references. Brought in experts such as guest writers to patch the missing documentation. She's not here, but Kadi Kraman is actually one of my favorite voices in the React community. Wonderful human being to follow. And added colorful illustrations, which turned out to be pretty popular. react.native.dev launched July 23rd in 2020. So that was about 6 months, right? I spent about 6 months on this. And it lifted React Native's user metrics, thumbs up to thumbs down, by about 70%. putting about every page on the site in an average of 85% positive ranking. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good response for like 6 months. That's not bad. Okay, I did it. Now will you let me do the React documentation? Well, yes, it was time to get to work on react.dev. We've got a convention now too, .dev. React docs, they have a huge responsibility. Once again, according to community surveys, 86% of React developers using the documentation actually got started with the docs. I guess the other 14% may have gotten started on YouTube videos. I don't have access to that data anymore. I'm sure I could fill this up with more entertaining factoids, but these are the ones that I wrote down. The project kicked off in May 2020, at the very start of the pandemic. I have the journal entry from this. I told you this was going to be a behind-the-scenes tour. I could give this talk in 20 minutes, but I have actually added a lot of fun doodles from how the process kicked off and what we did. I hope you enjoy them. So once again, like with React Native, I started with the community. I don't know if anyone remembers filling out the React community survey in 2020, but if you did, thank you. It really helped us pick the direction for the documentation. And the results were similar to React Native's. People wanted to see function components first documentation, as reactjs.org, as it was then known, was largely a collection of class-based documentation. And if you dove very deep, you could find the hooks documentation. But it definitely would give the impression that you needed to learn class-based React before hooks otherwise. So we needed to switch it over to function components. And we needed to provide a deeper hooks reference. There were essays about the hooks and how to use them together, guides, but there was not an easy way to go find the code you needed, copy-paste it, and put it into a new thing. I remember having to search very hard to find out exactly which, oh my gosh, oh sorry, I'm gonna leave this one. More visual content, and of course, interactive code, which had become very popular on training sites. Most documentation sites in 2020 did not have interactive code on them, but the trainers in the community had started to add interactive challenges and sample code to their courses, and people really enjoyed learning by doing. I'll explain why that is in a moment. There's a science behind it. So it started with brainstorming with Dan. We did this during a period when it was okay to meet people. We did not break lockdown, but we met up. We were fortunate to have a small window. We met up, and there were postcards, there were sticky notes, there were cookies flying everywhere. This is one of the samples of the things that we were drawing. This is what it's like to work with Dan. I really enjoyed how we started communicating in sketches, and we would continue to communicate with sketches, me understanding something, drawing him a picture, and him telling me, that's right, that's wrong, or my favorite response from Dan, which is always, not quite, let me correct you. Also made a new friend, a friend that we call React Head, speaking of doodling. So doodling was a very important part of my journey with React. Many of these doodles did not make it into the ultimate docs, but I found them to be a helpful learning resource. I could turn around and be like, did I get this right? Even came up with some very interesting ideas for visualizing state changes, like this notation format that I was thinking of. But I think the pandemic was getting to me by that point. But I started to doodle this guy, inspired by IKEA, who became known as React Head. And React Head, I used him to make notes of what I learned from Dan, in this case, updating the DOM. Often we ended up describing React Head as a waiter who was serving the end user something that had been cooked up in the component kitchen, as it were. And the finished versions of these sketches, some of them made it into the documentation. This is one of my favorite ones. If you've ever been ordering with somebody who can't make up their mind, and this explains how multiple inputs, which one will win, and the person's like, oh, I want this. I want the pizza. No, I want the carbonara. No, actually, just a coffee. that was, in this case, like a waiter, React knows, I'm only going to use that last order. I'm not going to update all of them. I'm only taking this one to the kitchen, which I found to be a very handy metaphor when I was learning how state works. We ended up with a spreadsheet of new content. This, by the way, is what it looks like when you're writing a tech book. By the way, Tejas, anticipate it, your editors, they'll work with you on this. But you end up with this huge sheet of content that needs to be created. And it's pretty intimidating working on the docs, because this was not like React Native's docs where we were improving what already existed and adding to it. This was a burn down. This team was very insistent that people don't understand React with the old model. We must burn it to the ground and replace it. And I was like, okay, that's going to be like 2 years worth of work, you know? Like, have you written a book before? This is you writing a book. Or you want to do that? And they were like, yes. And I was like, it's a good thing there's a pandemic, because we have a lot of time to focus. Went to beta in December 2020. I gave a little keynote about it at our online conference. I think the one React Conf that was online. React had made their debut. Wow! This is what we call inked, these illustrations that were once sketches. They're now perfectly aligned. I used to make comics, and a lot of my diagrams, they got converted into these amazing diagrams by Maggie Appleton, who carried it even further and created a diagramming system for the documentation, which is great because my diagrams were illegible. You can ask Dan. And of course, the interactive sandboxes. We didn't have Expo to partner on these. We partnered with Code Sandbox. They were a real game changer. People loved to interact with the code. One of the biggest challenges for me learning React was I would spin out for hours setting up the developer environment. And the truth is, most of us are not working on greenfield React projects. Most of us are coming into a company that already has React installed. We need to focus on React, not on configuring our developer environment, which can be very tricky. So this got people out of configuration mode and into exploration mode faster. People could get to hello world with these docs in under 5 minutes. And this is important because people learn by doing. There are numerous studies that show that on-the-job training is more valuable than a fresh college degree for somebody who has just come into tech, just started working. Why is that? Why is it more important to do than to just study, to even cram before a big test? There's a wonderful book called Make It Stick, and the book, I'll sum it up for you so you do not have to read it. It boils down to spaced repetition. This helps with retrieval practices. You remember in school when your teacher would be like, pop quiz, 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 answer the questions, and you would have to be like, There was a point to that because he was making you recall information that you had studied. And that recollection actually made it easier for you to fire those neurons and recall it in a similar situation in the future. So all of that cringy bug hunting you do early in your career and walking into walls, that's helping you because when you see those things again in the wild, you just have a reflex. It's so much more valuable than just studying React or watching talks. I go to a lot of conferences, but I learn most by my pet projects. So React invested in editable examples that let people interact with the code in 0 seconds, and no environment to spin up, no dependencies to fight. And at the end of each lesson in the documentation, each guide, we had these code challenges. These code challenges don't prevent you from moving forward. It's not like that. It's not a linear learning tool. You can do the code challenge or not do them. But in testing, most people chose to do them. And it tells you little hints from the React core team underneath so that you can get it right and understand why the code is behaving in these common missteps. But how do we know if any of this is working? Oh, is it time for me to go? Oh, it's all right. I'm kidding. How do we know if any of this is working? Well, once again, we ask real people. Alpha testing. I ran another survey with all our alpha testers when they'd completed playing with the new React site. And the alpha testers were 3 times more likely to recommend the new React documentation over the old React documentation. It's pretty good. So in March 16th, 2023, the docs were officially considered mission complete by the React core team. They added an onboarding tutorial. The API references were complete as well. It was time to ship. So classes folks, don't worry. The old site has been moved to legacy.reactjs.org. It's not going to receive many updates, but if you need to learn class-based React, it's still there. It's still there. But it won't be documented on this, the new react.dev with its shiny landing page. This site has 600 interactive examples, so you'll get your repetition practice in there. And the illustrations and interactive sandboxes that were trialed in React Native docs, they went on to change how we built React. It didn't spring fully formed from an idea. It was actually prototyped on React Native site. So yes, reactnative.dev, hearts react.dev. This was pretty exciting. 8 million learners were using this between the time it went from beta to live, which means a lot to me. I hope you'll love them both, but 8 million people being able to learn directly from the core team how to build the most modern style React, that is the sort of impact I want to have with my life. I owe this community a lot, and this was a way to give back. Now, special treat. You may have some documentation. Does anybody here have a project that has documentation internally or externally that they have to maintain? Okay, all right. Everyone else, leave the room. This is part of the talk is just for us. However, if you like to contribute to open source, most open source projects have terrible documentation because nobody wants to do it. Pro tip, doing the documentation is the best way to get access to the core team of your favorite project, because then you can come to them with doodles and be like, is this how it works? And they have to answer you. So just saying, if you want to give back to your community, you can start with the documentation of something that you use regularly. So maybe you should stay in the room for this one too. I don't like to think of react.dev and reactnative.dev as documentation. Some people call them developer portals. People get fancy with it. The truth is, I think of them as a human API designed to transfer knowledge from the engineers who built the thing one-to-one to the minds of the engineers who will build with the thing. That is a very difficult, almost like a human raid, if you will. And the shorter that loop is, the quicker that interval is between the time of building to the time of creating, the faster humans can move to the next level of whatever it is we're evolving towards. I want us to get there faster. I think we have a lot of potential as a species. Now, I always remember Sarah Drasner's quote that people who land on bad documentation will just bounce. They won't stick around. They won't learn or stick through the pain. This is true. React was in an exceptional space because it provided such a value and solved such a pain that it was worth it for some people to dig through all the GitHub comments, all the source code, all the notes, and then turn around and train the community. But most projects don't have that kind of community effort backing it, even if it is a commercial one. Most of them don't. And that's a real problem if you've got a life-changing project that you really believe in out there. If it cannot communicate to the people who need it, was it ever launched? Does a feature launching without docs really ever land? Does a tree falling in a forest with no one to hear it ever make a sound? All right, so we'll talk a little bit about building this human API. These are just some small tips that I typically give folks when people ask me, well, how should I build a cool developer human API? How do I do that for my project? Well, first off, you want to communicate, so set up a site. I encourage you not to think too hard about this. It's easy to set up a great site. There are a lot of boilerplate solutions out there. Docusaurus is industry standard at this point. It's pretty good. Gives you some great defaults around API references and translations. But there's also a new contender, which I'm really excited about, Astro's Starlight. This is what the Astro team uses to build their docs, and it's got such a great community engine behind it. I'm just like, the only problem with this is it's not written in React. But definitely check it out. I think it's, especially if you're building a project for multiple platforms, I think that Starlight offers some benefits that DocuSource cannot by virtue of being built with React. Did you know, by the way, true story, react.dev was built on Next.js. And we probably could have shaved about 6 months off of the ship time if we'd stuck with the framework that we had in place, which was Gatsby, or teamed up with DocuSource to build out the features that we were missing and shifted to that. But we did spend quite a bit of time building a custom Next.js site. So if you're thinking, you're looking at your doc space, get it, like code base, it's doc space, haha. I like to use that expression. But if you're looking at your doc space and thinking, we can solve all these problems with a massive transition to a new framework, put a pause on that. People can read markdown files. Like, it's more important you get the content out than you try to switch to another framework. I've been to many projects where every new engineer who comes and takes over the developer portal shifts to their favorite framework and no new content gets written. It's just one long, long, long migration story. Migrating your content is not the same as writing good content. Stop that. Write good content. Okay. True stories from the field. Now, you want to make sure that the content that you're providing is balanced. Most of the times when we're writing for people, we're just sort of like essays, 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 essays. But we're not really thinking about what we want the user to learn or what the purpose of what we're writing is. There's this framework called diataxis. It's a systematic approach to technical documentation and authoring. It's popular. There are other models like DITA, D-I-T-A, which were created by IBM. But this one's the easiest to use with something like DocuSource. The others require like orgs of 60 technical writers to execute with. You don't have 60 tech writers. This is open source. So diataxis is the writing format for the most of us. I like to look at it this way. It's like a pyramid, a food pyramid of understanding. You can organize your documentation into 4 types. Your API references, this is what comes out when you're building, when you're first launching a project. You should always have API references. You probably have them as comments in your code so that people can understand what each individual member of your API does. And then you have explanation, where you're kind of explaining how the things work together. These are your guides. Explanation, sort of like a concept of how all the things fit together. Tutorials are step by step. You walk people through how to do the thing. They usually sound like first, second, third, and then. That's the hallmark of a tutorial. And then lastly, guides. But the bedrock of all of this is the API references. As long as your API references are in place, your community can help you write the rest of them. As long as the React team was carefully documenting everything they did in their release notes, the community could help write and create the content for the rest. Even React Native, we were able to do that community effort to write the API docs because the engineers had carefully commented all of the code in source. All right, automate what you can. This is my favorite part. Once your code base starts getting really big, it can be hard to keep up with these things by hand. The good news is there are tools for transforming your code comments into API reference pages, such as JSDoc. Rust, for instance, they actually invested in test-driven example code for their documentation, which is wonderful because this means that anytime you see code in their documentation, it runs. Copy, paste, perfect every time. So you can actually integrate your documentation and your tests together. This is perfect because, remember, all your documentation has to be is complete and accurate. That's it. Get those done, everything else follows. Tests and documentation go together. They form a promise to users that when they do a certain thing, they can expect certain results. I worked with Danny back at AWS, and Amplify UI also adopted test-driven approach to their documentation, embedding the components themselves in every page. This is important. Take an interest in something called content design. I don't think as developers we're very familiar with content design. Sounds a little markety, doesn't it? But the truth is, Content design is a very well-studied art of how to communicate to other human beings important topics, not just how to buy a car. Well, that's actually pretty important too. But these are a couple of books I highly recommend. Docs for Developers is a great introduction to writing better for developers. But if you really want to dive deep, I also recommend Everyday Information Architecture, which if you're working with a brownfield project that's a little overgrown and you can't really tell the difference between those 4 content types when you look at it, you probably want this book. And lastly, Leading Content Design by Rachel McConnell. If you end up in a situation where you need to build a team of people who will do this on a regular basis, this book has some good insights as to what that team will do day to day. So that's your junior, your medium, and your senior right there. And lastly, join a community. It's always better to do these things with friends. And there's a very good international community of people who work on teaching other people engineering concepts, who build human APIs every day. And you can join them at writethedocs.org. Whew, all right. I think that's all for me. If you have any questions or you are passionate about this space, I invite you to come chat with me at Happy Hour. I look forward to nerding out about teaching developers and teaching the world how to think in React. Thank you for having me so much. It's been awesome.
That is exactly the talk I hoped it would be. Thank you so much for giving us that talk. It was amazing. From the things to be careful of, to the ways you can proactively automate what you can. I mean, really, it was a tremendous talk. Questions? We have a few minutes for questions, if you have any. No? Yes. Oh, wow. Ooh, we have... He said one question, maybe 2.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Okay, I'm happy to be here.
My pleasure.
Here. And a little question. I see in the example, poor JavaScript example, is it possible or is it correct to also have some TypeScript example in the documentation, or maybe it's our target to enhance with TypeScript when we need, because I think that a lot is working in TypeScript. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. Will the react.dev documentation ever include TypeScript examples, correct? You are asking?
Yes.
Got it.
I'm asking. I remember in the data that maybe I remember right or wrong, something I looked and I saw something.
So the React docs did not ship with TypeScript. And that was actually one of the, we'll follow up on that. Here's the thing, if you don't have a dedicated docs team, nobody will follow up on that. You know, only Astro actually follows up on their promises. But one of the follow-up plans was actually to write all the examples in TypeScript and then transpile them to JavaScript as part of a build step. So that would be a phase 2. I'm not actually sure if phase 2 is underway, but I think that's a great idea. Once again, an example of automating things. Because in our research, we found out like the vast majority of React developers are TypeScript first developers, and many people in boot camps, et cetera, are learning TypeScript first, not vanilla JavaScript. So I would assume for whoever is in charge of the documentation today, that would be top priority. And if you are writing documentation, you should definitely transpile TypeScript examples to JavaScript and put the TypeScript on the first tab. Like, you should do that. That is a good practice.
And if you're building that automation for your team, it's probably good to open source that and give it to the whole world.
Yes, exactly. Please. That would make my life a lot easier so I don't have to build it.
Great. And if you build it at Clerk, same thing. Okay, we have time for another question. Maybe more? Any hands? We're doing this auction style, okay? Going once, going twice. Excellent, Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me take this.
Incredible, incredible, come on.